The crime boss thought he could force Dean Martin into a business partnership. Dean's clever countermove not only defeated the mobster but left him begging for mercy, proving that sometimes the greatest weapon against intimidation is intelligence, connections, and the ability to stay calm under pressure. It was Friday afternoon, September 22nd, 1967, and Dean Martin was in his private office at the Sands Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas, reviewing contracts for his upcoming television season when his secretary, Margaret, knocked on the door with an expression that immediately told him something was wrong. "Mr. Martin," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "there are 3 men here to see you. They don't have an appointment, but they're very insistent that it's important business." Dean looked up from his paperwork, recognizing the tone that Margaret used when she was trying to communicate something significant without being direct about it. In 15 years of working in Las Vegas, Margaret had developed a sixth sense about different types of visitors, and Dean trusted her judgment completely. "What kind of business?" Dean asked. They said it was about new opportunities for investment and partnership. The gentleman in charge introduced himself as Mr. Vincent Torino. Dean felt something cold settle in his stomach. He knew the name Vincent Torino, though they had never met face to face. Torino was what law enforcement euphemistically called a person of interest in several ongoing investigations. A businessman whose legitimate enterprises were vastly outnumbered by his less legitimate ones. "And Margaret, would you mind staying close to your desk this afternoon? I might need you to make some phone calls." Margaret nodded, understanding immediately. She had worked for Dean long enough to recognize when he was preparing for a situation that might require careful handling. 5 minutes later, Dean's office door opened, and 3 men walked in. Vincent Torino was immediately recognizable as the leader. 58 years old, built like a former athlete who had traded muscle for authority, wearing an expensive suit that couldn't quite disguise the fact that he was accustomed to getting his way through intimidation rather than negotiation. The 2 men with him were clearly muscle, younger and larger, wearing suits that were tailored to accommodate the weapons Dean assumes they were carrying. They positioned themselves on either side of Dean's office door, a subtle but unmistakable message that this meeting would continue until Torino decided it was over. "Mr. Martin," Torino said, settling into the chair across from Dean's desk without being invited to sit. "Thank you for taking the time to see me. I know you're a busy man." Dean leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed but alert. "Mr. Torino, what can I do for you?" Torino's smile was the kind that never reached his eyes, the expression of someone who had learned to project friendliness while planning how to hurt people if they didn't cooperate. "I'm here to talk to you about an opportunity, Dean. May I call you Dean? We're going to be partners, so we should be comfortable with each other." Dean's expression didn't change, but internally he was already several steps ahead in the conversation, anticipating where this was going and beginning to formulate his response. "What kind of partnership are you talking about, Mr. Torino?" "Well, Dean, you've built quite an operation here at the Sands. The shows, the recording deals, the television work. You've got influence, connections, access to important people. That's valuable, very valuable." Torino paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "The thing is, operating in Las Vegas requires certain protections, certain arrangements. There are people who might want to interfere with your business, people who might cause problems for someone as successful as you. You need partners who can ensure that those problems never develop." Dean understood immediately what Torino was offering: protection from threats that Torino himself would create if Dean didn't pay for the privilege of avoiding them. "I see," Dean said calmly. "And what would this partnership involve?" 40%, Torino replied without hesitation. 40% of all your Las Vegas revenues, shows, recordings, merchandising, everything that generates income in this city. In return, you get complete protection and the assurance that your business interests will never be interrupted by complications. The demand was breathtaking in its audacity. Torino was asking for nearly half of Dean's Las Vegas income in exchange for protection from problems that didn't currently exist and threats that would only materialize if Dean refused to pay. "And if I'm not interested in this partnership?" Dean asked. Torino's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested that Dean had asked exactly the question he had been expecting and hoping for. "Well, Dean, that would be unfortunate. Las Vegas can be a dangerous place for people who try to operate without proper protection. Accidents happen, equipment malfunctions, key personnel become unavailable. Venues experience unexpected problems with licenses and inspections. It would be a shame if your career suffered because you weren't properly protected." The threat was clear without being explicit, delivered with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather rather than outlining how he planned to destroy Dean's livelihood if his demands weren't met. Dean was quiet for a long moment, appearing to consider Torino's proposal, while actually implementing a strategy he had been developing since the moment Margaret had announced his visitors. "Mr. Torino," Dean said finally, "that's a very generous offer, but before I make any decisions about partnerships, I always like to do some research. Make sure I understand who I'm dealing with. You understand?" Torino's smile widened, suggesting that he interpreted Dean's response as the beginning of a negotiation rather than a rejection. "Of course, Dean. Due diligence is important in any business relationship. What would you like to know?" "Well, I'm curious about your other business interests, your track record with previous partners, that sort of thing." "I assume you have references I could contact." Torino laughed, a sound that contained more menace than humor. "Dean, I think you're overcomplicating this. This isn't the kind of partnership that requires references or research. This is the kind where you say yes, we shake hands, and everyone benefits from a mutually profitable arrangement." Dean reached for his phone, a gesture that immediately caught the attention of both men by the door. "Actually, Mr. Torino, I think I'll make a few calls right now. Get some opinions from people whose judgment I trust." Dean dialed a number from memory, waited for someone to answer, and then spoke in a voice that was loud enough for everyone in the room to hear clearly. "Frank, it's Dean. I've got Vincent Torino in my office, and he's made me an interesting business proposition. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about Mr. Torino's reputation and business practices." There was a pause while Dean listened to Frank Sinatra's response, but his expression gradually shifted from neutral to something approaching amusement. "Is that right?" Dean said into the phone. "Well, that's certainly interesting information. And you say this is all documented?" Another pause, during which Torino's confident expression began to show the first signs of concern. "Frank, would you mind making a call to Giancana? I think he'd want to know that Mr. Torino is operating in Las Vegas without proper authorization." The change in Torino's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. Sam Giancana was the Chicago crime boss who had ultimate authority over Las Vegas operations, and anyone conducting business in the city without his approval was asking for serious trouble. "Wait," Torino said, his voice losing its confident tone. "There's no need to involve Chicago in a simple business discussion." Dean held up a finger, indicating that he wasn't finished with his phone call. "Frank, would you also mind calling our friends in law enforcement? I think they'd be very interested to know that Mr. Torino is in Las Vegas making unauthorized business propositions." Dean listened for another moment, then nodded. "That's perfect, Frank. Yes, I'll wait for them here." Dean hung up the phone and looked at Torino with the same calm expression he had maintained throughout the entire encounter. "Mr. Torino, it seems that your business proposal has generated some interest from people much more important than either of us. Mr. Sinatra is contacting Sam Giancana to inform him that you're operating in Las Vegas without permission. He's also calling the FBI, who apparently have been very interested in your activities for quite some time." Torino's face had gone pale, and Dean could see him calculating how quickly his situation had deteriorated from confident intimidation to potential disaster. Both groups should be here within the next 30 minutes, Dean continued. I suggest you use that time to decide whether you want to be here when they arrive, or whether you'd prefer to be somewhere else, preferably somewhere outside of Nevada. The transformation in Torino was complete. The confident crime boss had been replaced by someone who understood that he had made a catastrophic error in judgment. Martin, this is all a misunderstanding. I was just exploring potential business relationships, nothing more than that. Dean's response was delivered with the same warm tone he used for everything, but with an underlying firmness that made it clear the conversation was over. Mr. Torino, I understand that you thought I was someone you could intimidate into a partnership I didn't want. You were wrong. I also understand that you thought I was operating alone, without protection or connections. You were wrong about that too. Dean stood up from his desk, signaling that the meeting was concluded. What you didn't understand is that I've been working in Las Vegas for 15 years, and I've developed relationships with people who have genuine authority in this city. People who don't appreciate unauthorized operators trying to muscle in on established businesses. Torino and his two associates were already moving toward the door, understanding that their window for leaving voluntarily was closing rapidly. This isn't over, Martin, Torino said, but his voice lacked any conviction. Yes, it is, Dean replied firmly. It's completely over. And Mr. Torino, if you or anyone associated with you approaches me or any of my businesses again, the phone call I make next time won't be to give you 30 minutes to leave town. After Torino and his men left, Dean called Margaret into his office. Margaret, would you mind calling hotel security and having them make sure our visitors actually leave the property? And could you also call the Las Vegas police and let them know that we had some uninvited guests who might be worth keeping an eye on? Margaret smiled, the expression of someone who had just watched her boss handle a dangerous situation with exactly the right combination of intelligence and authority. Of course, Mr. Martin. Should I also call Mr. Sinatra back and thank him for his assistance? Dean laughed, the first genuinely relaxed sound he had made since the meeting began. Actually, Margaret, I never called Frank. I called the weather service, but Mr. Torino didn't need to know that. The story of how Dean Martin had defeated Vincent Torino's intimidation attempt became legendary in Las Vegas, told and retold as an example of how intelligence and established relationships could triumph over threats and bluster. Torino left Las Vegas that evening and never returned. Within 6 months, he had been arrested by federal authorities on charges related to his other business activities. Charges that might have been pursued less aggressively if he hadn't drawn attention to himself by attempting to extort money from someone with Dean Martin's connections and reputation. Years later, when people asked Dean about the incident, he would always downplay his role in the confrontation. Torino made the mistake of thinking that entertainers are easy targets, Dean would say. What he didn't understand is that to survive in Las Vegas, you need to be smarter than the people trying to take advantage of you. And sometimes you need friends who are even smarter than that. Is this story of intelligence triumphing over intimidation inspired you? Make sure to subscribe and hit that like button. Share this with anyone who needs to know that the best response to bullying is often a calm, clever strategy rather than confrontation. Have you ever had to outsmart someone who was trying to take advantage of you? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to ring that notification bell for more incredible stories about the moments when brains beat brawn.